You think you can push me around? Derek said, his voice low and firm as he stared down the flight attendant. Not today. Watch as this single dad takes a stand and shows that no one messes with his family, especially when they think they can get away with it. But when the tables turn, it's not just about being a father, it's about holding your ground. Hey, Story family, welcome back, and thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm so excited to share this powerful, heart-pounding story with you all. If you're ready for a wild ride filled with drama, suspense, and unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this with your friends. And don't forget to comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. Now let's dive into today's incredible story. Derek, a 35-year-old single dad, was doing his best to balance life as a father and a hard-working professional. His 2-year-old son, Elijah, was his world. They were on a flight from New York to Nevada, heading home after a long trip. The flight was long, and Derek had Elijah comfortably nestled in his seat, trying to keep him entertained with toys and snacks. The young child was well behaved. As usual, quiet, curious, and always eager to look out the window. Derek's eyes narrowed as he looked at Sarah, a flight attendant whom has been watching him sternly, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising frustration inside him. "Ma'am, my son is fine. He's sitting quietly, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure he's comfortable," Derek said, his voice now tinged with irritation. He glanced down at Elijah, who was still sitting peacefully, his small hands resting on the tray table, completely absorbed in the view outside. Sarah, however, didn't seem to care about the calm demeanor Elijah was showing. She crossed her arms, standing tall as she glared at Derek. "That's not good enough. You need to make sure he's secured in his seat properly, or I'll have to report it," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. Derek clenched his jaw, trying to hold back his frustration. He had been flying for years and had never had a problem with his son's behavior. Elijah was a well-behaved child, quiet and respectful, especially for a toddler. But Sarah's persistent attitude was starting to rub him the wrong way. He could feel the tension mounting in his chest as she continued to stand there, eyeing them with disapproval. "I've already told you, he's not moving around. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do," Derek said, trying to remain calm. "He's not causing any trouble." Sarah didn't seem to acknowledge his words, her expression unchanged. "If he's not secured, it's a safety violation," she insisted, her voice growing more insistent with each word. "I'll have to notify the captain if you don't follow the instructions." Derek could feel his patience starting to snap. He understood the importance of safety on a plane, but he knew Elijah was sitting properly. This wasn't about safety, it was about power, control. And Sarah, for some reason, seemed to have singled them out. "Ma'am, I'm doing everything I can here," Derek said, his voice firm but tinged with frustration. "There's no need to escalate this." He glanced down at Elijah again, whose small eyes were still wide with curiosity, completely unaware of the growing tension between his father and the flight attendant. Sarah's gaze remained hard as she watched Derek, clearly unfazed by his attempts to reason with her. "I'm just following protocol," she said coldly, as if Derek were the one causing the issue rather than the other way around. "And you need to follow mine. I've already warned you." Derek exhaled sharply, trying to keep his cool. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on them, and he hated the thought of making a scene, especially with his son watching. He looked around, hoping someone would step in, but no one seemed to care. It was just him, Elijah, and Sarah in this uncomfortable standoff. "I understand protocol," Derek said, keeping his voice as even as possible, though he could feel his patience slipping. "But I'm telling you again, my son is fine. He's secured in his seat, and he's not causing any trouble." Sarah's face tightened, and she took a small step closer, her tone still cold. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to escalate this. It's for everyone's safety," she said, her voice firm but condescending. Derek's heart raced, but he knew he couldn't let this escalate further. He didn't want to cause trouble, especially not with Elijah so close by, but Sarah's insistence was pushing him to his limit. He looked down at his son once more. Elijah, still calm and oblivious to the rising tension. His innocent face only made Derek more determined to put an end to this. He couldn't let this flight attendant make Elijah feel like he was a problem when he was doing nothing wrong. Derek took a slow, steadying breath. "Look, I'm not going to argue with you anymore," he said, his voice low and controlled, though it was clear the frustration was beginning to seep through. "I know the rules. I know what's safe. And I'm telling you, there's no problem with my son." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. Her lips pressed tight into a line. She stood there for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully, but Derek had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let her harass them any further. "I'll be making a report," Sarah said with finality, her voice cool and resolute. Derek's hand reached for his phone in his pocket, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. His jaw clenched, but he didn't say another word. He wasn't going to let his son be treated like this. He knew who he was, and he wasn't about to let an overzealous flight attendant make him feel guilty for being a good father. This wasn't just about the inconvenience. It was about respect, and he was going to make sure that his son was treated fairly. Derek dialed a number he knew by heart, and as the phone rang, he locked eyes with Sarah, refusing to back down. "We'll see how this gets handled," he said under his breath, more to himself than to her, but loud enough for her to hear. As the phone rang, Derek's mind was already set. If she wanted to push this further, he wasn't going to take it quietly. Not now, and not ever again. The tension was mounting with every passing minute. Sarah kept making rounds, glancing at their row, her gaze always lingering on Elijah. And each time she passed, she seemed to find something new to criticize. Derek tried to keep calm, but it was becoming harder with each unwarranted comment. His mind kept racing, wondering why this was happening, why Sarah seemed so focused on them. He looked at Elijah, who was now clutching his stuffed bear, his little eyes wide with innocence, unsure of what was happening around him. Derek's frustration was growing, but he didn't want to let it show. He had been trying to be a good father, and all he wanted was to get through this flight without unnecessary conflict. Yet, Sarah's constant attention on them was making it impossible. Every time she walked by, it felt like a reminder that he and his son didn't belong in her eyes. It made no sense. Elijah was behaving just as any child would on a long flight, quiet, well-mannered, and patient for his age. Yet, none of that seemed to matter to Sarah. Derek let out a sigh as Sarah approached again. This time, she didn't wait for a moment of eye contact. She walked directly to their row and stopped at their seat. Her gaze was icy, and there was no hiding the judgment in her expression. She crossed her arms, her lips set in a firm line. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp and unyielding, "your son is still not properly seated." Derek's stomach tightened. He glanced down at Elijah, who was sitting so still, so obedient, that he could have been mistaken for sleeping. His little hands were clutching his stuffed bear, his face a picture of calmness, not a single movement out of place. Elijah was being the epitome of what a child should be on a flight, yet Sarah stood there, still unrelenting. "He's fine," Derek said, his voice strained as he tried to suppress the anger bubbling up inside him. "He's not doing anything wrong. Why do you keep singling us out?" Sarah's eyes flashed with irritation, and for a brief moment, Derek thought she might say something even more hurtful. Instead, she just shook her head, her tone dripping with condescension. "I'm just following orders," she said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "You're not exempt from the rules, sir. If you can't control your child, I'll have to report it." The words hit Derek like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected to be threatened in this way, especially after everything he had done to make sure Elijah was behaving. But it wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the implication. The assumption that because he was a single dad, Somehow he wasn't capable of handling his son. The constant scrutiny. He felt his hands tighten into fists. His teeth ground together, and he had to fight the urge to raise his voice. He wasn't going to let this woman control the narrative. He wasn't going to let her undermine his parenting or make him feel like he wasn't doing his best for Elijah. "Look," Derek said, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "I don't know what your issue is, but I'm not going to argue about this anymore." He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure my son is comfortable and behaving. I'm not some negligent parent. I'm not going to sit here and let you continue treating us like this." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment there was silence. Sarah's face didn't soften, but Derek could see a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Maybe it was the way he stood, tall, shoulders squared, not backing down, or maybe it was just the sheer exasperation in his voice. But whatever it was, she seemed to hesitate for a brief moment. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, but then stopped herself. Sarah didn't back down entirely, but she didn't push further either. She stood there for a few more seconds, her gaze lingering on Elijah, who had remained completely still and unaware of the confrontation unfolding around him. Derek's hands relaxed, but the tension in his body didn't completely ease. He glanced down at Elijah, who was now looking up at him, his small face a mixture of curiosity and concern. Derek reached out, gently brushing his son's hair back from his forehead, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's okay, buddy," Derek whispered to Elijah, his voice soft and comforting. Elijah, sensing the calmness in his father's tone, gave him a small smile and returned to clutching his stuffed bear, his attention shifting back to the window. Derek stood up, facing Sarah, feeling the weight of her unspoken judgment, but no longer letting it affect him. "I'm done with this," he muttered under his breath, then turned to face the aisle. He wasn't about to let her control the narrative or make him feel guilty for being a good father. Not today. As Sarah watched him walk away, she said nothing more. Derek didn't care. He was done trying to explain himself. All he wanted was to finish the flight in peace with his son, without being made to feel like an outsider. Elijah was the priority now, and Derek wouldn't let anyone take that away from him. Derek stood there, phone still in his hand, feeling the heat of the moment simmering beneath his calm exterior. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on him, a smug look on her face, as if she believed he was merely trying to avoid confrontation, or that he backed down like so many others would. But Derek had reached his limit. His patience was no longer something to be tested. He was done with the baseless accusations, the judgments, and the humiliation of being a good father. As the phone continued to ring, Sarah's posture stiffened, and Derek noticed her growing impatience, as though she were waiting for him to be intimidated. But as soon as the voice on the other end of the line answered, everything shifted. "Hello," came the calm, professional voice. Derek exhaled quietly, the tension that had been building inside him slowly releasing. Hearing that voice, the voice of someone who truly understood, who had his back, was all he needed to stay calm. He took a deep breath before responding. "Hey, it's Derek," he said, his voice steady, yet firm. "I need you to pull up my flight details. There's an issue with one of the attendants." The response on the other end was immediate, without hesitation. "Of course, Derek. What's going on?" "I'm on Flight 1087, New York to Nevada," Derek said, keeping his tone even but with a sharp edge. "There's a flight attendant here who's been harassing me and my son for no reason. She keeps accusing us of things we haven't done, and it's escalating." There was a brief silence as the person on the other end processed the information. Derek could almost feel the weight of the authority behind the words when the voice responded. "I'll handle this. Don't worry, Derek. You're in good hands." The phone call ended, and Derek looked up to find Sarah still standing there, her arms crossed and her impatience growing. Her expression, however, had begun to change. Gone was the smugness. Now there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Derek hadn't expected this to be easy, but he had just taken the first step to ensure that the situation was handled the right way. "What's the problem, sir?" Sarah's voice was sharp, and her eyes were filled with an unmistakable suspicion. Derek didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly at Elijah, still sitting quietly beside him, oblivious to the storm of emotions unfolding around him. Derek gently squeezed his son's hand, offering him a reassuring smile. He then turned his focus back to Sarah, who was now standing much more rigidly than before, perhaps sensing that something was about to shift. Before Derek could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle. A crew manager, a man in his mid-40s with a calm demeanor and a serious expression, appeared at the end of the row. His uniform was neat, and he looked every bit the professional Derek would expect from an airline staff member. The manager's presence immediately sent a ripple of unease through Sarah. "Excuse me, ma'am," the manager said, his voice polite but firm. "I need to speak with you." Sarah's face drained of color. Her eyes widened as she registered the situation, and for the first time, Derek saw her hesitate. She opened her mouth, but the words died in her throat. The crew manager's gaze softened slightly as he turned to Derek. "We've been informed by the airline's senior leadership, and we need to address this," he said, offering Derek an apologetic but professional smile. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for words, but there was nothing. The smug look that had once adorned her face had now vanished, replaced by the stark realization that she had miscalculated. "Senior leadership," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't need to check it. He knew exactly who had stepped in. The voice on the other end was his brother, and the airline CEO had already been alerted. Derek didn't want to use his family's position as leverage, but Sarah had pushed him too far. His son was the most important thing in his life, and he wasn't going to let anyone treat him poorly without standing up for what was right. Sarah's face went pale as the weight of her actions sank in. The manager, sensing her panic, gave her a sympathetic but firm nod. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we need to take you off duty for the remainder of the flight. There will be an official review." Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. She was caught. It was over for her. Derek didn't smile, didn't gloat. He had made his point, and that was all that mattered. Elijah, still holding his bear, glanced up at his father, looking a little confused but sensing the calm that had returned to the situation. Derek turned to the crew manager, giving him a subtle nod of appreciation. "I'll handle it from here," Derek said quietly, but firmly. The manager acknowledged him with a slight bow, stepping back as Sarah was quietly escorted to the front of the cabin. Derek's focus shifted back to Elijah, his little boy who had been caught in the middle of something neither of them had asked for. But in the end, Derek knew he had done what was necessary to protect his family. As Sarah disappeared from sight, Derek let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the situation finally lift. He could feel his pulse slowing, his hands relaxing. For the first time on the flight, Derek allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't about using power, it was about standing up for what was right. The flight would continue, but now, Derek and Elijah could finally finish the journey in peace. And nothing at all, was going to take that away. As Sarah was escorted away by the crew manager, Derek sat back in his seat, letting out a deep breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The weight of the situation seemed to lift from his shoulders, and he could feel the tension leaving his body with every exhale. The injustice he had been feeling, the frustration of being judged unfairly, all seemed to fade as he turned his attention back to Elijah, who was still quietly sitting next to him, clutching his stuffed bear with a look of confusion on his small face. "Dad, what happened?" Elijah asked, his voice soft, the innocence of a 2-year-old shining through. He hadn't fully understood the gravity of the situation, but he could sense the shift in the atmosphere around them. The tense moments had passed, and now everything felt calm again. His large eyes looked up at Derek, seeking reassurance, the kind only a father could provide. Derek smiled gently, ruffling his son's hair with a soothing touch. His heart swelled with love, and he couldn't help but feel the pride of being Elijah's protector. "Don't worry, buddy. Everything's okay now," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. He wanted Elijah to feel safe, to know that no matter what happened around them, his father would always make sure he was all right. The rest of the flight passed in a calm that Derek hadn't expected. Without Sarah's constant, unwarranted scrutiny, the atmosphere in their row felt lighter. Elijah, once again, returned to his little world, staring out the window at the clouds, pointing at things in the sky, occasionally asking Derek innocent questions. It felt like any other flight, a father and son traveling together. Nothing more, nothing less. The flight attendants who passed by no longer gave them an unfriendly look. There was no more tension, no more discomfort. Derek could finally relax. He leaned back in his seat, his mind quiet for the first time in hours. He thought about everything that had happened, the unfairness of the situation, how it felt to be targeted, and how he had stepped up, not only to protect his son but to stand his ground. Derek wasn't the kind of person who looked for confrontation, but this time he had done what was necessary. He had used his position, not for power or dominance, but to ensure his family wasn't treated with disrespect. When the plane began its descent, Derek felt a sense of pride rise in him again. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about doing what was right for his family. He had protected Elijah, and in doing so, he had also set an example. He had shown his son that standing up for yourself, standing up for those you love, was something to be proud of. It was a moment of strength, of grace under pressure, and it was something Elijah would carry with him as he grew. As the plane touched down in Nevada, the captain came over the intercom, apologizing for any inconvenience caused and assuring passengers that the airline was committed to providing excellent service. Derek listened, the captain's words echoing in his mind. He couldn't help but think how the apology, while appreciated, also felt like a subtle acknowledgement of what had happened. He had handled the situation the way it needed to be handled, and in the end, everything had worked out. Derek glanced down at Elijah, who was still looking out the window, his little fingers pressing against the glass as if trying to touch the clouds. He was a world away from the tense moments they had just shared, and Derek smiled. He couldn't ask for anything more than to see his son happy, safe, and growing up with the understanding that he was loved and protected. "Ready to head home, buddy?" Derek asked, his voice warm, but with a hint of anticipation. It was the end of their journey, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where Elijah would understand that the world could sometimes be unfair, but he was never alone in facing it. "Yeah, Daddy," Elijah said, his face lighting up with a bright smile. "I love you." Derek's heart swelled with pride, the love for his son filling him in a way that words could hardly express. He bent down, giving Elijah a gentle kiss on the forehead. "I love you too, kiddo. Let's go home," he said, his voice full of warmth and emotion. As they disembarked the plane, Derek felt lighter, his heart content knowing he had done what any good father would do. He had protected his family, stood up for what was right, and taught Elijah that no matter what, love and strength would always guide them through the toughest of times. Together, they walked off the plane, ready to face whatever came next with the unwavering bond between them, a bond that would never be broken. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more amazing content, and share this with your friends. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, and let me know where you're watching from. Thanks again for joining me today, and stay tuned for more incredible stories.